Our first group will be the first Sternorhyncha for us to discuss, the aphids. These pear-shaped insects are found in almost every kind of plant where they are phloem feeders that produce copious honeydew. Most aphids don't seem to overly harm their host plants, but some aphids cause severe plant reactions that result in twisting or curling of the foliage and tender shoots. Some aphids also vector virus diseases among plants. Many aphids are tended by ants that use the aphids as livestock. The ants generally collect the honeydew produced by the aphids, but the ants will also eat some of the aphids for proteins. In fact, some call aphids ant cows. Many aphids also have very complicated annual life cycles that involve parthenogenic and sexual reproduction and alternating host plants. In general, aphids have pear-shaped bodies with long filamentous antennae, long legs, and a distinctive set of tubules arising from the hind dorsum of the abdomen. These tubes are called cornicles, and they are involved in the secretion of alarm pheromones. In a colony of aphids, there can be alated, or with wing individuals, and apterous, or without winged individuals. Aphids are notorious for having complicated life cycles in which they alternate between a spring host plant and a summer host plant, as well as alternating between asexual and sexual reproduction. The asexual females are termed parthenogenic, and these all give the appearance of live birth. In this case, the egg is actually formed with a shell inside the female's oviducts, but instead of being deposited, the egg finishes its embryological development inside the female and hatches as a fully developed nymph. This is called ovo, for egg, and viviparous for live birth, ovoviviparous. This is very different than mammals that form a placenta for the embryo's development, or just viviparous. Many aphids have complicated life cycles whereby they alternate between an asexual and parthenogenic phase, where females are all ovoviviparous, giving live birth, and a sexual phase in which females are oviparous, that is, they lay eggs that overwinter. These aphids also tend to alternate between a spring host plant and a summer host plant. This results in a taxonomic nightmare because each of these phases can result in different forms of the aphid bodies. So, let's explore this life cycle in more detail. We'll start with the egg stage. Aphid eggs are generally attached to the bark and branches of woody perennial plants. These eggs are usually bean-shaped and tucked into cracks and crevices of bark or glued to the bases of leaf buds. In the spring, when the host plant is starting to have sap flow, those eggs hatch. The eggs hatch into stem mothers, which are parthenogenic and ovoviviparous. These stem mothers can have a unique body form, or they may be virtually identical to their offspring. The stem mothers are usually apterous forms. Their nymphs begin feeding immediately upon emerging from the mothers, and they usually develop into apterous females within a few days and begin giving live birth too. As the area becomes crowded, the nymphs begin to form wing pads to become alates, or winged adults. These alates can remain on the original host plant or fly to new locations or new plants of the same species to repeat the process of asexual reproduction. Typically in June or July, most of the offspring develop wings and suddenly will leave the spring host. These are called spring migrants. The spring migrants fly to the summer or alternate hosts, and for some aphids, this alternate host can be an annual, perennial, or woody plant. On the alternate host, the aphids continue their parthenogenic and ovoviviparous habits, but the offspring can be of a different color and form. The offspring continue the asexual reproduction until fall weather conditions cause the females to produce two winged forms, sexual males and female aphids. These sexuals fly back to the spring host plant, mate, and the females lay eggs, then die. You've probably seen the fall flight of these aphids and not been aware of it. Sometimes when you're hiking or sitting on your deck in October, and are experiencing one of those classic Indian summer days, you may have noticed that the air is filled with what looks like gnats. These are actually the fall migrating aphids. The green peach aphid is an extremely common species that is found on many kinds of greenhouse, field crop, and ornamental plants. The summer generation is known to feed and asexually reproduce on hundreds of different kinds of plants, but the sexual reproductive cycle is only found on prunus species, with peach, apricot, and plum being preferred. In the greenhouse, this aphid can continue without the sexual cycle. This also happens in many of the southern states that don't experience hard freezing temperatures. There are several species of aphids that can be found on landscape roses. The completely green ones are usually the green peach aphid, but if there are pink aphids on a rose, those will usually be the rose aphids. Here's an illustration of the aphid life cycle using the green peach aphid. This one is oriented to vegetable producers, but you could substitute many other plants for the summer hosts. Notice that the aphids are only on their spring peach host for 2 months, with them moving to the summer hosts in June. In this case, the summer hosts are potato and lettuce plants, but as you have already seen, the aphids can be on roses and dozens of other plants. The aphids continue to cycle through alate and apterous females that are all parthenogenic and ovoviviparous. In September, the females produce winged sexual males and females. These fly back to the peach branches to lay eggs. There are many species of aphids that produce abundant waxy filaments that cover their bodies. These are generally called woolly aphids. One of the most common species is the woolly apple aphid, which can be very common on crabapple trees. The sexual and spring generation is also common on American elm. This one has a complicated life cycle where it can have continuous asexual reproduction on apple trees, but it undergoes this sexual cycle by flying to elm trees in the fall to lay eggs. Here's a graphic that illustrates the life cycle of the woolly apple aphid. The most important part of the cycle is the continuous asexual forms that occur on apple. During the summer months, the aphids generally build up populations on apple bark, where there is some callus tissue that is formed with branch pruning or bark damage. They will also develop colonies on expanding spring shoots. In the fall, some of the aphids will produce sexuals that fly in search of elm trees. If they find an American or slippery elm, the sexuals will mate and attach eggs to the elm branches, usually at the bases of leaf buds. In the spring, these hatch and develop woolly aphid colonies on elm leaves, which usually cause curling around the colonies. These undergo several generations before producing winged aphids that fly to the apple trees. On apple, nymphs will also crawl down the tree and enter cracks in the soil in order to find apple roots. Once they find roots, they begin feeding, and their feeding can cause gall-like nodules on the roots. In the spring, some of the offspring of these root-feeding aphids move back up the tree to the branches and callus tissue. It appears that young apple trees can be severely stunted by the root-feeding and galling aphids, but there are rootstocks that can resist this attack. The black bean aphid is another very common species that occurs in our landscapes. As the name implies, it is also an important vegetable garden pest. This aphid is dark olive green to black in color, and if you look closely, the abdominal segments often have small white dots on each side. The aphid alternates between its spring hosts, that are usually winged euonymus and viburnum, and over 200 summer host plants. The summer host plants include a range of garden vegetables, especially beans and potatoes, as well as a wide range of flowering plants. It overwinters as eggs attached to spring host plants. As new leaves begin to emerge, the eggs hatch and the stem mothers move to the new leaves to feed and give live birth to their daughters. The feeding of these aphids often cause severe twisting and curling of the expanded shoots and leaves. These twisted leaves can become fouled with the honeydew. After several generations, winged forms fly to summer host where there are several more asexual generations. In late summer, sexuals are produced which fly back to the spring host to lay eggs. The Oleander aphid is a cosmopolitan species that is found in most tropical and subtropical regions of the world. It is thought to be a native of the Mediterranean area. In North America, it most commonly attacks oleander and all the plants in the milkweed family. Though it is supposed to be a tropical or subtropical species, it is commonly showing up in northern states on milkweeds. It is either overwintering as nymphs at the bases of plants or possibly flying northward each season. It has a bright yellow body with black legs, antennae, and cornicles. It is probably bright colored to discourage predators, but it is often attacked by lady beetles, syrphid fly larvae, and aphid wasps. In midsummer, high populations can foul plants with their honeydew and promotion of sooty mold. The beech blight aphids are a fun and spectacular species. It can be found on most beech trees, but it seems to prefer shady locations. The aphids apparently overwinter as eggs on their host trees, but don't undergo the spring and summer host migrations. They can build up large numbers of individuals that feed on tree branches. They are another woolly aphid, but they secrete copious honeydew that promotes the growth of a very large species of sooty mold. What is most unique about this species is that when disturbed, the aphids wiggle their abdomens that are covered with long, waxy threads. This has given them the alternate name of the boogie-woogie aphid. No major damage has been documented for this aphid, but some claim that they may kill small branches. There's another woolly aphid that gets on European beech, the woolly beech aphid, but that aphid only infests the undersides of leaves. The giant bark aphid is the largest species found in North America, with adults regularly exceeding a quarter inch in length. It is most frequently found on basswood, sycamore, pignut hickory, but will also use oak, pecan, and walnut as hosts. The colonies generally develop on limbs and trunks where the bark is thin. This species is one that doesn't seem to have an alternate host, but it still undergoes a spring asexual reproductive cycle for most of the spring and summer, then undergoes a reproductive cycle at the end of the season. Asexual adults and sexual adults do not differ in form. Eggs are attached to crevices on host tree bark. Because of their large size, they can produce copious amounts of honeydew that can foul sidewalks and roadways where tree branches overhang these areas. The long legs of the aphid sometimes confuse people into thinking that they are some kind of spider. The conifer aphids in the genus Cinera is a very large and diverse group. Some have even suggested that they should be in their own family. All are medium to large-sized aphids. When you look closely, they have short conical cornicles. Almost every conifer around the world has at least one species of Cinera that attacks it. In this image, I've included the white pine aphid, which is usually found on the bark of white pine trees. Again, the long legs can confuse folks into thinking they are a cluster of spiders. They are interesting because when disturbed, they often quickly withdraw their mouth parts and run away. There are common species that regularly infest spruce branches and junipers. All produce honeydew, and they generally have asexual reproduction during the spring and summer months, and in late fall sexual forms are produced which attach black eggs to the needles of their host for overwintering. The spotted pine aphid is an invasive from Europe. It can be a very common pest on Scotch pine Christmas tree plantations. The colonies can completely cover needles, and their honeydew can cause extensive growth of sooty molds on the tree needles and branches. This aphid is often found on senescing needles that are showing chlorosis, but the aphids are apparently not the cause of that chlorosis. Like many of the conifer aphids, this one undergoes asexual reproduction for most of the summer, but sexual forms are produced late in the season, and these attach eggs to the pine needles for overwintering. I find it interesting that aphids often turn up on the top 5 landscape pest lists made by the landscape care industry. Even though most aphids do not cause death or severe damage to landscape trees, their large colonies and honeydew-producing habits are always of concern to the average gardener. Most aphids are well controlled by predators such as lady beetles, syrphid flies, and green lacewing larvae. There are also a large number of tiny braconid wasps that are collectively known as aphid wasps. These take their toll on the aphid populations too. Unfortunately, many of these biological controls don't arrive until after the aphids have built up large populations and have produced considerable honeydew. On small plants, hosing the aphids with a strong jet of water will generally dislodge them, and most won't be able to make it back to the plant. Likewise, aphids are very susceptible to what are called soft insecticides. These are horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps. Both easily kill the soft-bodied aphids, but only by contact. However, when aphids build up large populations on taller trees, especially trees in parking lots or over decks or sidewalks, treatment may be needed to reduce the honeydew issues. Such infestations are easily treated with systemic insecticides, but use caution to avoid using these insecticides if the trees are about to bloom or are in bloom. Dormant oils are also effective for killing overwintering aphid eggs. Speaking of biological controls, let me discuss some other issues with aphid control. It has been well documented that ants tending aphids usually protect the aphids from predators and parasites. Some studies have shown that keeping ants from protecting the aphids generally results in rapid attack by the most important biological controls. This has been commonly accomplished by applying a ring of insecticide dust or granules around the base of the plants to be protected, so that ants have to cross this barrier to get to the plants. Some of the most common predators are lacewing larvae, lady beetle adults and larvae, syrphid fly larvae, and the little aphid wasp. We'll discuss these in greater detail in the module on biological controls.